Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. Alrighty then. This is the preparatory materials for today's office hours. So um, I'm just going to run commentary on this and then read from the article that I've sort of attached in here as well. And I'm going to leave the office hour so that actually office hours can occur. So, and I will come back to comment on this, of course, but the have all the material there. So I began with a quote from Joan Robinson: "If knowledge develops as capital accumulates, there need be no tendency to diminishing returns. And with constant returns, there can be no tendency for the rate of profit to fall, QED." But that's now there are several issues that this implies, right? The key element, or one of the ideas that Marx comes up with, well, actually, he's commenting on other people's work, as we'll see in a moment, but the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. The fact that it does, and it does, it's supported historically, as I'll point out. Tendencies of rate of profit to fall do come with capitalist crises. Now, the point, of course, is from a revolutionary point of view, from a radical point of view, is how, if these happen, and they do, and they did, like 2000, like in the last major financial crisis, these are reasons to for political change. And so this idea is important, whether you fully invest in it, and whether, as we've seen historically, that people will see that, well, does it just is this built in to the way the economy works, or can we do something not only to fix it, which is the liberal solution, or an anarchist solution would be to push it further and hence create more crisis and change the economy. Now, you can argue in a very obtuse way and in a very cynical way that the current economy, the sort of smash and grab capitalist economy at the present moment, is doing that. Well, it sort of is doing that. We're in stagflation now, and so that implies that we could, and we will probably, um, almost half the states in the United States of America are having some kind of recessionary event, a recession-like event. And so, if you were doing this on a state-by-state basis, the fact is you aren't going to get state economies to fail. But although they have run into quasi-bankruptcy situations before, which could be interesting if each state in the United States had enough sovereignty to, really act as if they were sovereign states. And they don't really, even though everyone likes to say California is the fourth biggest economy in the world. It is, but it's not a completely free economy, or free. It doesn't have sovereignty because, it has the benefits or deficits of a federal government, and among other things that would imply that we should that Californians should secede. So, that's really not a point of contention at the present moment. So, but the idea here, getting back to the original idea, is that, is there radical subjectivity built into this movement towards crisis? Because that's what Marx was thinking about in the 1840s up through the 60s. There were financial crises, serious financial global crises, at least in the 19th century, and of course, serious political change. of a variety of sorts. And if you pay attention a little bit to the history, you know that there are a lot more monarchies then than there are now. Now, without getting into a kind of exceptionalist argument or whatever, one can see that within the context of proletarian life, or however you want to talk about it, and which actually is an interesting literature in terms of Marx's opinion of what was going on in America, and that that there were things that suggested that the kind of revolutionary potential that he wanted to see, and that in some ways we expect from a materialist point of view, a historical materialist point of view, was going to happen. Now, without getting into the weeds on this, uh, the technical interest that I have anyway in it is this that it fits into a very large literature that has taken decades of work and interest uh, from a global point of view, much of which has been problematized by the gaps in Marx's own writings, the subsequent editing, the endless, internecine struggles among academics about this, and all of the usual business. The point is to read it and to sort of appreciate. I mean, the only reason why to do it from an academic point of view is to, these are interesting logical questions. And we usually come back to the same stuff, which is, if you've been following my fiddling around here, deals with the question of subsumption. How is it that we can get uh, value? How is it that we can talk about value? How contingent is value on price? How and in the larger context, the issue of quote unquote surplus value, that a surplus is created. Now, the point, of course, is that Marx is not thinking of surplus value as wealth. He's thinking of it as this sort of intermediate phase that is a means by which how the economy itself works. Uh, and this is usually at scale. I mean, individual surplus value is, you could define it and you could broadly measure it, but it's not worth very much. Whereas from a collective point of view or social point of view, an economy's point of view, it's important to think about surplus value as a way of talking about this. Now, whether it's palpable, that is surplus value, and measurable and all those other things, those are all uh, contingent on a whole bunch of other matters. But all of these things I've been talking about, hone our analytic ability. Um, Occasionally, some people try to resurrect certain ideas. G.A. Cohen's work, analytic Marxism, a bunch of other things are out there that they allowed people to have academic careers. They added to the research. They got set aside by a variety of folks. Some people gave it up because they were just getting hassled too much or marginalized by it. And of course, there is that. There is a literature for that too. You could, argue that there is a marginalizing literature that sits within the context of Marxist thought, and it's all quite amusing. And part of getting uh, having an academic career, and then there are the careerists, and then there's all the other usual psychopathic problems that sort of come with the discipline. So aside from all that, and as I have not mentioned, that all of this fiddling around here impinges on some work I want to do, and it sits in several different places. That is, from an academic point of view, it raises certain questions about the um, cultural economy, whatever that might be, the economy of cultures, um, which is problematic and has its own literature and overlaps with a variety of other fields. So there's that. Um, but that the important thing is that it's always seen as a kind of superstructural activity, an epiphenomenal in some ways activity, and it may be so, but in terms of treating the field, but like others who are, have some economics training academically and occasionally do something that might be research oriented, There's a lot more to figure out, and it's not simply because of sort of the necessity built by career. I don't have to teach courses in it, even though I feel kind of compelled to do it at times, and I don't really do it. And that is that there's an interesting collective project. There are many interesting collective projects of trying to sort out these points of view on Marx, et cetera. Some, as it were, recreate or remake the wheel. And those are all problematic because, somebody says they have a new thing or a new idea. Um, and then there's the usual economic, political economy fractures built within it. That is the difference between discussing uh, the kind of metabolic metaphor, the, the metabolic elements and its history, which are clearly important, but also comparing that with other matters that need to be sort of resolved relative to Marx on nature, recognizing, of course, that in all of these matters, Marx is constrained by his own life, and that we need to take this further, and that it's not about adhering to a certain ideological position, although that is certainly clear that many people have trouble enough that credentialing occurs, and people worry about that. So, in that sense, we need to sort of figure out other matters simultaneously. So, anyway, what happened here? Come on. All right. Sorry, there was a little bit of a see if we're all in the same place. Okay, now. So we're going to begin now. That may not have been a good preface for what I was talking about, but as I read through this, I'll stop at various moments, do a little annotating work, and hope that when we get to the actual office hours, you might have a question or two that we can discuss. Um, I hope to do this further in the future, and that is this idea that whatever I've been fiddling around and working with will, and it won't be the complete combination of things, namely because talking about things is too slow relative to reading and writing about stuff. So I will be doing other things, but today because we're starting this new schedule, I wanted to be able to present some stuff, talk about it a little bit, clarify it in that sense where I'm, discursively, messing with it, and hope that somebody will ask questions, hopefully of useful and discursive usefulness, whatever, exchangeability, and we'll get there. All right. So the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is a theory in the crisis. This is Wikipedia's version of TRPF. Is a theory in the crisis theory of political economy, according to which the rate of profit, the ratio of the profit to the amount of invested capital, decreases over time. Now, with our Joan Robinson quote, this diminishing returns occurs. Yeah, and we're fine. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. That's sort of what Robinson was talking about. Now, she has the advantage or disadvantage of being, sitting at Cambridge and not worrying so much about these matters. Um, the reality is, of course, and in the Marxian sense, you want to bring this forward to some sort of analytic critique of political economy, and of course, whatever is going to advance the historical development of whatever is going to happen after capitalism, or capitalism moving in the historical materialist context forward. uh, to ultimately give us, some brand of socialism, because we are actually moving in that direction. And to come back to what I started yakking about was that, from an anarchist point of view, and it is, of course, as it were, a tanky position, um, is that it's coming down under its own weight, or that you can see, because of avarice, stupidity, the motive force of capitalism. You can see it all arrayed, and you can see all of the various characters in it, and much to our distress. And of course, people have died because of it, which is really the most important moral humanist thing about all of this. So the ratio of the profit of the profit to the amount of invested capital decreases over time. Our economies are driven by this. This hypothesis gained additional prominence from its discussion by Karl Marx in chapter 13 of Capital, volume 3. But economists as diverse as Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, and William Stanley Jevons referred explicitly to the tendency of the rate of profit default, TRPF, as an empirical phenomenon that demanded further theoretical explanation, although they differed on the reasons why the TRPF should necessarily occur. So, for example, some scholars, such as David Harvey, argue against this, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, as a quantitative phenomenon, arguing it is the internal logic driving the movement of capital itself, noting that, this is, you can, and Harvey's argument is a good one, to say, well, it's a phantom in that sense. Once you figure out that it's happening, history may have already passed, driven past you. And it is more about, and speaking from a Hegelian point of view, not that Harvey was, because he disclaims his interest in Hegel, even though, it's pretty clear he's, in that ballpark. Um, that internal logic is actually the key moment for discussing these kinds of matters. All right. Anyway, Jeffrey Hodgson stated that the theory of the TRPF has been regarded by most Marxists as the background of revolutionary Marxism. Now, according to this view, its refutation or removal would lead to reformism in theory and practice. Now, that covers a lot of sins and issues. Reformism is problematic for a lot of revolutionary thinking. A lot of backsliding, as they say, or being co-opted or whatever. Reformism is a serious issue, and one that has political context that is not necessarily related to TRPF. I mean, you can say, oh, okay, profit rates are falling. We're going to have a revolution, blah, blah, blah. That ain't going to happen. It's much larger and more complicated than that. But TRPF is a way of thinking, at least thinking about the problem, looking for, and I would assert that this is, in terms of the latest literature, it is to look for the signs of TRPF, not to, fully, take it apart and whatever, because TRPF happens, is a widespread phenomenon. It does happen at the problem, of course, as with Marx, is to say, what happens at scale? What happens in the larger economy? Small businesses fail, people screw up, bankruptcies occur, all of that sort of stuff. And, is that, can that be a reason for revolution? Well, actually, one can think so, because, of course, um, from a humanist point of view, everyone should be supported. We have enough collective wealth, and it's unequally distributed, that if we redistributed, everything would be fine, and fewer people would die, if nothing else. On the other hand, more people are being created, which let's not get into the reasons why that is a good or a bad idea, but that is placing a scale-like pressure on the larger questions of, what is to be done, what is the scope of history, blah, 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 blah. Stephen Cullenberg stated that the TRPF remains one of the most important and highly debated issues of all of economics because it raises the fundamental question of whether, as capitalism grows, this very process of growth will undermine its condition of existence and thereby engender periodic or secular crises. So we're still there with crisis, right? That that Marx's model presumes a certain set of things that are going to occur, crises. Now, whether one survives the crises, whether it creates new structural problems, et cetera, all of those are important. And we can see in just looking at, for example, 20th century history, that periodic or secular crisis, defines the whole essence of 20th century history up to the and including the moment of war, which is kind of where we are now in a variety of places, some of which is speculative, some of which has other dynamics at work. And of course, amidst all of this is the mode of production capitalism, which continues to churn on, and people are, of course, doing their thing, and some more explicitly than others, which is where the current crises are occurring. So, in 20th century, this is still the Wikipedia version. Discussions of Karl Marx's economics, the transformation problem. That is the problem of finding a general rule by which to transform the values of commodities based on their socially necessary labor content. Already, this is a problem for a lot of people. What is socially necessary? How is it that the labor, according to his labor theory of value, how is it that labor relates to all of that? And transforming the values of commodities into the competitive prices of the marketplace are problematic. Or, and in fact, you could even say that this idea of the statement of it as it is, transforming values of commodities into competitive prices, is problematic in and of itself. Why isn't it the case that it's the reverse? And yes, some actually have argued that it's the competitive prices that come first, and a lot of people build their entire lives and worlds around that. Far be it from me to delimit their existence, needless to say. The point is that markets exist. Marx isn't against the market. Marx isn't against competition. Marx is clearly against capitalism, but markets were there before capitalism. So, you need to get over whatever issues you've got about over determining or stereotyping, profiling the kind of goals that Marxism has or that anti-capitalism has, because that may be really what's more about what this is all about. The first problem was first introduced by the Marxist economist Conrad Schmidt and later dealt with by Marx in chapter 9 of the draft of volume 3 of Capital. Now, in past weeks, we looked at where this fits in the larger body of Marxist work. Essentially what we're looking at is the oeuvre, the writings, the manuscripts from about 1861 to about 1867. And a lot of stuff going on in there. And, the draft of volume 3 is somewhere in there, amongst other things. Marx is writing about all kinds of stuff. He's trudging over to the British Museum / British Library and et cetera, et cetera. And he's doing all this kind of stuff, aside from trying to do his day job, which doesn't really give him a lot of money. And he's trying to have a family. And, all these things are going on. And so we have to fit these things within the context of his life. Would that we had the same sense of the volume of work there. And it's pretty clear that people who actually do a lot more work than I've done on Marx and his writings, it's pretty clear that he did a lot of stuff, even though everyday life had all these kinds of issues. And of course, Marx spends time. There's another 20 years before he dies, so there's a whole 20-year period in which Marx is sort of thinking about all this stuff. Some of the stuff he's got is out there and worth defending, worth correcting, thinking about other stuff. all that's going on. And Marxist scholars now are spending time because of at least the organization of the material allows us to rethink that kind of material. And so that's kind of what's going on. The essential difficulty was this: given that Marx derived profit in the form of surplus value. Now, remember, we spent a little time the last couple of weeks discriminating between profit and surplus value. At one level, they are identical, but that's at a highly, rudimentary level. And the reality is that surplus value describes something where profit has all kinds of shapes and forms. If you had this thing, P, pi profit, it would be nice and easy, but it doesn't do that. And because it is, socially necessary in the big picture. And so estimating or constructing or configuring surplus is interesting, problematic. And from direct labor inputs, and that the ratio of direct labor input to capital input varied widely between commodities, it does. Now, how do you reconcile all of these differences? And of course, this idea of the difference, we were just looking at that in the later Marx, well, not the later Marx, but the later portion of the writing from 61 to 67. The ratio of direct labor input to capital input varied widely between commodities. Now, how can we reconcile this with a tendency towards an average rate of profit on all capital invested among industries if such a tendency, as predicted by Marx and Ricardo, exists? So we're thinking about, of course, tendencies. And it could make you crazy to worry about these things, but other people are working on this. There's actually empirical data. There's capitalist data or data. It is data, just data. That is the idea that, for example, thinking about the Federal Reserve and blah, 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 the data's out there. Now, of course, there are always idiots who will want to take that data or not even allow that data to see the light of day, which is the current problem with labor statistics, because the current administration doesn't want you to see the numbers, how bad they are. And they think that if they can hide it from you long enough, you won't notice or you'll forget about it. Well, the fact is you can't, you won't. There is data. It may not have been summarized properly, but it's there. It's still accessible. Until ultimately Trump goes down and arrests everybody in every Federal Reserve Bank or whatever. The data is going to be collected, despite the fact that there's some attempt to, obviously obfuscate, create disinformation, all those elements. So without being too horribly cynical, one needs to sort of think about kind of basic elements. But now, if you're teaching an undergraduate course, you want to get students to sort of sort this out, not worry so much about the branding, as it were. That Marx is a bad word because some idiot who is clueless about it decides to use it as a label for things he doesn't like. And we've seen that. Entire election has been built around it. Now, the reality, of course, is that no one who's ever heard this being thrown about truly knows what's going on, or even what they're talking about, which is pretty clear from, as we know recently. So we shouldn't worry so much about it. We should just say, okay, and without all the other kind of rebranding and stuff, Marx is just one of a number of classical political economists, and in fact, he is. He uses the same literature. He's talking from the same body of data. And of course, Marx has his own little way of thinking about this. And the labor theory of value is not unique to Marx. So, and of course, the definition of what labor is becomes problematized. And of course, some of the basic issues about labor, that is labor, the question of workers, et cetera, is different from the Marxian position, or that it's a more subtle difference, the question of labor power as opposed to labor, or direct as opposed to indirect labor, or paid labor versus unpaid labor, the wage relation, all of those things. All of those are problematized in the economy. And so one should not worry if you call someone a Marxist, it really doesn't, it's really rather superfluous, although, and some of us joke about it simply because if you don't talk about it, or if you don't mention it in your work, but yet still retain the critical analytic tools, was Minsky a Marxist? Well, you know, even the fact that, there are a bunch of people who are Marxists who never mention Marx in their work at all, but the analytic tools are essentially Marxist in origin, or at least classical or non neoclassical, let's put it that way, and or heterodox as opposed to orthodox, post Keynesian, all that they're all of a piece, and some of them are contradictory. Some of them have problematized elements. There's some people who, because the dominant form in certain academic institutions was economics from a largely neoclassical position, where you learned, price theory, micro, macro, blah blah blah. Um, Often it wasn't very useful because you were assuming away so much stuff that uh, the political got lost from a political economy, assuming, of course, that you could simply look at it as a neutral thing. It's never neutral, never is, um, ultimately, because it is ultimately socially necessary. So anyway, Marx defines, so back to the text, we're still in this Wikipedia thing. It's only for 4 paragraphs. Marx defines value as the number of hours of labor socially necessary to produce a commodity. Now, this includes 2 elements. First, it includes the hours that a worker of normal skill and dedication would take to produce a commodity under average conditions and with the usual equipment. So Marx terms this living labor, sort of real life, right? Second, the second element of value, it numbers of hours of social labor socially necessary to produce an economy. And we'll get to the next bit in a moment. Second, it includes the labor embodied in raw materials, tools, and machinery used up or worn away during its production, which Marx terms as dead labor. So living and dead labor. This embodiment thing is the deal that is always screwed people up, because they assume a kind of phenomenological kind of, this is the problem for ontology is, what is the being of nature as materials and as constructed materials and the embodiment of technology, et cetera, et cetera. And it's one where you don't have to confuse yourself, and you don't need to take a kind of litmus test about the analysis. The fact is, there is a material world out there, and there's people who are alive in it, including vertebrates, invertebrates, blah, 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 blah. And so there's a lot of things out there, and they are, metabolically related. They, you make yourself crazy if you're trying to imagine that that there is labor embodied in biology, for example. Now, you could, and you could measure it, but what would that get you? The labor power of amoebas or whatever. Not to make too stupid a notion about it, but the point is, labor is an abstraction. Labor power is a further abstraction. Socially necessary labor or socially necessary labor power are not identical. And so all of these things have nuance. Nuance is fine. We just need to be, not to get too crazy about it, because, of course, people will try and take down your argument by saying, well, it's just a belief system or blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but everything is a belief system. You can't isolate one from the other. it's like, why don't we tax churches, for example? Just no reason not to. And among many other things that we would not tax, so to speak, you know, just one needs to sort of see it in its larger context. All right. In capitalism, workers spend a portion of their working day reproducing the value of their means of subsistence, represented as wages, that is necessary labor, the things that you deem important to keep yourself alive, are compensated for as wages from one way or the other. And a portion of their day producing value above and beyond that, referred to as surplus value, which goes to the capitalist as surplus labor. So the simplest thing here, this is what it is. You have, you need to stay alive. Uh, Wages are one means by which you can help that process. And of course, it is problematic for all kinds of reasons. It is why people do crime, for example, or other kinds of things, which are much more complicated or become complicated, particularly in terms of the legal structures of society. But anyway, point being, there is surplus value. It can be defined as surplus labor. It has relative and absolute components. And all of this helps to construct all of these. These are constituent parts of what's going on. And the issue, of course, is that you can measure it by money, right? By money. Now, even the money issue is problematic because money is not neutral. It is a commodity form. It could be hoarded, but you're being stupid if you do. But these kinds of things happen. So, as I said with the other stuff, it's a little more complicated than that. But if you think of it as a large, more fluid kind of thing, I think you'll see that it's not a problematic way of thinking about how all of this fits together. Now, we're still in the Wikipedia portion, since, according to Marx, the source of capitalist profit is this surplus labor of the workers. And since in this theory, only new living labor produces value, it would appear logical that enterprises with a low organic composition, that is, a higher proportion of capital spent on living labor, a low organic composition that is a higher proportion of capital on living labor. So low organic, this is the issue that was very key for Marx during the period, is that technology was, certain types of machines were labor saving, and that they created, means by which, and this is just simply following the classical political economy model, is that if you assumed all that was happening, then organic composition would be important to determine whether you're having a higher or lower rate of profit. And so that's there. Would have a higher rate of profit than would enterprises with a high organic composition, a higher proportion of capital spent on raw materials and means of production. So, one is more labor intensive, one is more technology or machine, this is not difficult. High and low organic composition. Now, organic composition is problematic because, organic covers a whole bunch of stuff, right? It's nature. It is raw materials, but it's also the point at which an entire process is involved to refine the metal, to, dig the metal out of the ground, refine the metal, make it into stuff, make it work, and, whatever, and which it either supplements or complements or replaces humans, right? Okay. However, in models of classical perfect competition, which you can't fault, a liberal democracy or liberalism, classical liberalism, would presume in an idealistic way that things could be perfect. Well, they aren't. I mean, they just aren't. I mean, things in physics are more perfect because they're not so alterable. They just are there, and yet they're not there in the sense that it's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, like gravity, for example. Forces. While gravity seems ubiquitous, um, you can work around that, as we've seen, the vomit comet, for example. All right. Higher rates of profit are not generally found in enterprises with a low organic composition, right? And low profit rates are generally not found in enterprises with a higher organic composition. So that's a very simple, remark on a very simple dichotomy, right? Between, rates of profit and organic composition. But yet there is organic composition. So our whole entire model here is based on an abstraction between high and low, organic or inorganic, ultimately, and humans and nature and blah 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 blah. The fortunate thing about Marx is he thinks about these things and he thinks, well, okay, you can make these distinctions, but it's important to remember that they're all still metabolically, connected. Um, Stuff happens. There's problematic stuff that happens. Rust or whatever. There's stuff happens. Instead, there's a tendency towards equalization of the rate of profit in industries of different organic compositions. So, what Marx is trying to figure out here is, okay, if I wanted to make a revolutionary argument about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, I would need first to equalize all these things or get a kind of handle on what is the aggregate, the agglomerative, what the total is of all this stuff. And noting, of course, that there are different organic compositions and that how do we level all this out? Now, this is already an abstracting process. So you want to sort of see, well, what's the dynamics of this? And in all of these cases, this is not a static model. This is the problem when you teach it, is that static models don't make much sense because everything is moving around, and you could say stuff about static models, but the ultimate comparative component of it is the fact that it's constantly moving. And some principles you could apply, and you could think about probabilities and statistically thinking about all these matters, but ultimately it's still much more complicated. So thinking about, for example, linear programming and just-in-time production and blah, 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 minimax, et cetera. It's nice to be able to put it in a linear model, but, the life is not, I mean, maybe your life is a linear model in the sense that you live and then you're going to croak, but there's a lot of other stuff going on, and most of it is, as it were, residual. That is, in such models with no barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are, things that prevent you from entering, quote unquote, a market. Now, but it's not only a reflection of the production process. Recall that Marx is about production, and so what he's talking about is barriers to entry for a firm to compete in a market. And so in a model with no barriers to entry, and the whole issue, of course, of institutionalism is the barrier to entry. There's constant institutional barriers to entry: racism, sexism, the law, patents, all kinds, enough capital, etc. Barriers to entry, membership, right? Capitalists are free to disinvest or invest in any industry. A tendency exists towards the formation of a general rate of profits constant across all industries. Now, the general rate of profit is just good for Marx to be able to say, okay, it's either going up or going down. Is it the time for revolution or not? Is crisis happening, coming, catastrophe, blah, 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 blah. And yes, we can make some judgments about that. We can see that, the market for electric vehicles has been sort of screwed up on the one hand. On the other hand, you can see that it's become more segmented. The market is not disintegrating. It's just that certain people are making more money off of it for a variety of reasons. And you need to sort of sort out what's going on there and not get too wound up in it. Because otherwise you make yourself, sort of nuts about, okay, who makes the best electric vehicles? No, they don't, they have less regulation. So if they run into a wall, more people may die, but Some people don't care. Or the other answer is don't run into walls or don't drive so fast, or put in um, some sort of thing that controls that, whether it's the road itself in terms of self-driving cars, or you restrict stuff like speed, or you put limiters. There's ways of doing this that aren't, there are so many different solutions for this, like not have a car, just take mass transit. Um, if you have trouble getting somewhere, massified versions of transit are all you need. If the world were properly constructed, no one would need any cars. You would bicycle places. You would um, call up, and the bus would come around to wherever you needed to come and take you wherever you needed to go. And the system would be so well organized that there wouldn't be any worry about, well, it's too expensive to come out and get you or whatever. Other things could happen. Let's put it that way. Okay, so without getting too far into the weeds on that, all right, that's the extent of the kind of front ending the issue of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the organic composition of capital. So I hope that's somewhat clearer. Now, key historical events have provided empirical examples. So there's proof for this. I mean, insofar as empiricism demands, examples and evidence, it's there. Uh, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall clearly occurred during the Great Depression. Rate of profit fell substantially in the years leading up to the Great Depression. Studies indicate that the high levels of capital accumulation alongside technological advancement did not correspond to higher profits, leading to a crash. Now, part of that was exacerbated, with all due respect, to um, certain idiots and tariff policy, Smoot-Hawley, et cetera. So that was part of it. So it wasn't the complete cause of it, but it clearly was part of the problem, because certain idiots thought that they could do certain things and assumed certain things about global markets, which clearly were bad assumptions. They were just bad assumptions. They weren't paying attention. They assumed that certain things were always going to be that way, or that other things weren't, going to be screwed up for X number of reasons. All these things happen. Some people were smart enough to sort of anticipate it. Other people were just sort of caught up in their own little daily lives and sort of didn't really want to think about it, but they should have, because thinking about it actually made some of these things either worse or better. But people, whatever. So we haven't even talked about class, right? Even in all of the sort of other elements, class is still at work. It's just one of those little examples that helps divide up some of these problems. It's clear that the decisions, high levels of capital accumulation alongside technological advances, did not correspond to higher profits, leading to a crash. So this divergence did not correspond to higher profits. So, and we're dealing with big macro things, which is why there's a whole group of folks who think that economics should disappear as a profession, and that we should all be in engineering schools doing structural dynamic analysis, which is fine. That's how, essentially, that's how you handle the economy. And the fact that fewer economists, or very few economists, are really trained in thinking that way is causing real problems, has caused real problems. And the profession itself is partially to blame. And everyone's part of that problem, Marxists too, because there's only a small proportion of Marxists who, and don't even worry about whether it's Marxist or not, people, right? This is the Minsky thing, as I've mentioned. And Minsky's not the only guy, right? Post-Keynesianism was built around a whole bunch of heterodox economics. Is really a much larger thing that we'd want to talk about. But the fact is, it's out there, and it's all there, and it could have benefited from better ways of thinking about the quantitative issues. So anyway, post-World War II economic fluctuations note that in the history of 20th century economies, you had wars and et cetera, but you also had centralization of economies, you had efficiencies, you had innovation. All of those things are happening. But also the fluctuations are interesting and problematic, and in certain periods you want to try and solve that, right? Post World War II, the Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods, you have all these things that are created to try and fix some of these problems, uh, that were learning problems, right? Recall, of course, that the League of Nations fails, UN close to failing, but still there, fortunately. But it needs to change. So you got all these things going on that, but the United Nations was there to solve the League of Nations problem, which resulted from a whole bunch of other things. And without getting into the political science of it, it is, or international relations, it's pretty clear that certain elements either weighed in or weighed against these kinds of issues that were, frictions in the system that made the structural dynamics more problematic, and that they were endogenous and not exogenous. But anyway, that's another story. Uh, Post World War II economic fluctuations. Research indicates that, and what I'm reading from here is the AI summary of this, which is not a bad summary. It's just that, as I was just yammering on here, is that there are a lot of other things going on. But the summary is fine. You don't, you're not going to plug and play with this. This is not Jeopardy. There's other things. And so AI tends to overdetermine certain kinds of things. And it's just simply because the language model hasn't, we don't have enough power, computing power, to get past some of these issues. So therefore, we have simplifications that are interesting, sometimes correct, a lot of times totally off base. So anyway, research indicates that the rate of profit experienced declines during significant economic downturns. It's sort of part of the, comes with the territory, contrasting with periods of accumulation and growth. See, the word accumulation, as we haven't talked about that there are types of accumulation. The accumulation that's sort of appropriate or uneven or layered because of the different modes of production. Accumulation under capitalism is not the same as accumulation under feudalism or slavery. I was pretty clear that slavery is that. But anyway, for instance, the 1970s stagflation saw a decline in profits as inflation rose, reinforcing the TRPF theory. And in fact, we're currently in stagflation, or, well, you could argue about it, but anyway, there's probably stagflation going on somewhere in a fair amount. And stagflation in general, it is, could be a bigger issue. But anyway, so the 2008 financial crisis analysis of corporate profits before and after the financial crisis shows a declining trend in profit rates, despite high levels of investment in technology and innovation. You can already see that's a compositional problem, right? You had a lot of things being created, and we had lots of computers, and this should have not happened, right? With lots of computers and blah 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 blah. No, it wasn't about computers so much as it was in certain structural things and certain agency issues. You had capitalists willing to rip off folks. You had literally a class of rentiers, and you had a concentration, oligopolies, et cetera, that all screwing this up. And you could see, if you just traced back to the issues of subprime mortgages and blah, 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 that regulation would have probably gotten us out of this thing. But it's clear that the anti-regulatory forces, and in some ways an anti-government ideology, but also just simply motivated by greed, took on a lot of risks that they shouldn't have. And the shouldn't means that they were simply being greedy and screwed up the system, not realizing they screwed up their own little part of the system, not realizing that it would screw up everything. Needless to say, data highlight an increased focus on shareholder profits at the expense of broader investment. And you can see what the issue was, the issue of shareholder profit taking, that value, and we're back to the word value again, it was problematized, right? Some people didn't want to share. Some people knew they had to share, or they should have shared. And that had to do with taxes, anti-government tendencies, racism, classism, all that other stuff. And investments were screwed up because everyone sort of assumed in a kind of, and they teach this as equilibrium in the models, uh, economic models, and you think it's going to solve itself, but it doesn't. Um, it, People seem to think that, oh, well, if it's in equilibrium, it's stable. Well, in fact, in a big picture, and this is why structural dynamics is important, it may look like it's stable, but in fact, it's just, terrible things are happening and you're not paying attention, whatever. All right, academic studies. Several studies have quantitatively assess the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and that is data from the US economy and the rate of profit from 1929, important date, right, the crash, to 2011, sort of a couple of years after this is sort of the recovery from the recession, showing a long-term decline, particularly during and after major economic recessions. So this point of rate of profit. So rate of profit has a path through this stuff, but other things are going on at the same time. So you can't just say, well, rate of profit does this, and therefore we should do that. Can't do that. It's just simply a little marker. I mean, during the same period, there was pandemics, disease, births, demographic change, new technology, all kinds of stuff happened in that 80-year, 90-year period. Um, so yeah, it seems ponderous and make your head hurt, but the reality is that, tendency of rate of profit to fall is an interesting idea, and you could do stuff with it. But its own position in this entire structure is relatively minor. The point is, from a Marxist point of view, you go, see, it's been there all the time. You know, the people will, trash you because, well, you're against profits. You want to constantly redistribute it. Well, yeah, but that's because it should be redistributed from an economic growth point of view and not hoarded like people who buy too many Lamborghinis or whatever. So that's the thing. International comparisons, research comparing multiple economies like the UK and Japan has shown similar trends. So, in other words, the assumption under the LMM model is that this was talking about the US economy, but it's globally they're pretty much similar. Of course, you can get to the details. The shift in the UK to a service economy and Japan's bad decade and there's all kinds of other stuff, the role of basing your economy on gold or not on gold or manipulating currency and blah, blah, blah. Oh, there's all that kind of stuff. And one just needs to get a handle on it and not worry so much or worry. Actually, you should worry when people say stupid stuff like, oh, well, tariffs. Getting into a trade war is going to actually make it all much more efficient, which is all bullshit because the people who are doing it don't know what they're talking about. They truly do not know what they're talking about. So that is really where, it's going to be ugly. Where profit rates decline during economic downturns, suggesting a universal tendency across capital. That's a reasonable generalization, but that doesn't get you anywhere really. And it's all too many other things going on: global north, global south. Capital exports or exporting capital, blah blah blah. All that kind of stuff is going on. Capital accumulation and technical change, the relationship between capital accumulation, technological advancement, and profit rates is crucial. So, increasing capital intensity. Empirical observations show that as industries become more capital intensive, remember, we're talking about organic composition of capital. Capital intensity is a way in which we can talk about organic composition. So don't get too crazy about the definitions. Yes, there is an entire literature on this, and there's volumes on TRPF and organic composition, and there are lots of equations. But the language here gets problematic. Now, empirical observations show that as industries become more capital intensive, the average rate of profit tends to decline, just like Marx. Marx is talking about this. This occurs because the organic composition of capital increases diluting the surplus value generated. So the simple arguments that Marx was presenting are pretty hold true, but they also hold true because he was just simply agreeing with kind of a consensus of political economists, classical political economists. Where this gets screwed up is where it becomes more quantitative. You have people saying, well, you can refine this even further, and you can become more analytic about it, and you can actually have people function as experts to try and manipulate this stuff. But in reality, a lot of decisions are much more crazy, and history intervenes in really insane ways. I mean, you have um, robber barons, you have wars, you have, you know, there's all kinds of stuff going on that make this, an economist would say, well, diluting the surplus value generated, right? Or there were increases in the organic composition of capital. Well, you can make that statement, but it doesn't give you much explanatory power. Except for this one little trend or this sort of effect connection. Now, that's okay. It's just that when you think about it, it's much more complicated. You have, uh, from a Marxist point of view, you have the problem of a distributional economy or circuit of distribution and a circuit of production, which are part of this larger system. And it's not just department one, department two. There's other departments, but it is you have to think of it in this fairly simple way with the simple algebra that Marx provides, among others. Um, Marx just gives you this way of sort of thinking about it in a way that working people clearly understand, or I would like to think that they do, about, what am I working for? Why am I a wage slave? All of those things. It's just that you can't reduce it to that, even though if you're a labor organizer, you kind of have to talk that way. But, recognizing that it's a little more complicated than that, and that everyone should appreciate that it can't be simplified in that sense because we've made it impossible to simplify, even though we talk that way. See, that's the whole issue of schooling in that sense. Anyway, the empirical evidence supporting the tendency of the rate of profits to fall, especially in relation to major depressions, tendency of the rate of profits to fall, especially in relation to major depressions, includes historical analyses of significant economic downturns, quantitative studies across various economies, and the interplay between capital accumulation and technological development. All well and good. These findings suggest a persistent trend that challenges the sustainability of profit growth in capitalist systems, particularly during periods of economic crisis. Now, persistent trend that challenges sustaining profit growth under capitalism, particularly during crisis. And you can see how, we can go back to 2008 to see, what was the reaction in that case. And you can see this happening every day when people are being stupid about stuff. And we know that other things are happening that make it even more stupid, and, it could all come apart. But the reality is it hasn't yet, and it might not ever. It will just, have this kind of stagnation. So anyway, that was an example of Duck AI, I think, is driven by Chet GPT-4, I think, whatever. But anyway, so those generalizations are fine. And that's what, AI, so-called AI, but LLM gives us. And hopefully you can accept that as a reasonable way of talking. Now, what I want us to do, and we don't have to do this together, you can do this on your own. I've included videos so that you can think about these matters. And there's, of course, more technical details and a kind of Marxian position that you could adopt, knowing, of course, that it's conditioned by a whole bunch of other things. So there is, yes, thinking of it as a law is equally problematic. Maybe it's just a rule and not a law. And so that's a whole nother set of issues. So I included one about that, and a much bigger problem. And then Michael Roberts, one of the few people who actually knows what he's talking about because he used to work in finance in the city, in capitalism, in the belly of the beast. And so he knows what this is. What he's trying to do is say, well, all that stuff's happening. let's not get too crazy about the Marx question, even though he's a Marxist. Let's see it in its biggest picture, and so Michael Roberts is useful in that particular context. And he thinks about this constantly. So this is all good stuff, and I'm hoping that his like will not fall away. Now, underlying that is a set of issues that I've been fiddling around with, only because I didn't understand it as well as I should have. And so now I'm back to trying to understand it in that way, in a simplified way, that it's not simple, in fact, or that it is problematic, in fact, because it is simplified. Although you can write books on it or get tenure with it or whatever, but because clearly there was factions were, lines were drawn, membership cards were given out, transformation problem. What is the single system sort of issue, the TSSI problem? Well, it is a problem in selecting variables or reducing the problem to certain single moments or whatever. And so now to argue whether it is or it isn't Marxist is, some people spent far too much time worrying about it. Some of us just don't worry about it. I mean, you could argue the argument is an interesting one. It has certain mathematical consistency. It depends on certain other things that you do with it. That is, what you assume it to do, what you assume it can't do, which is another issue. And worry not so. I mean, because there are a couple of guys you know, who are so driven by their ideological position on this that they, kind of are not very pleasant people to be around. But that's decades ago. The issue, of course, is that TSSI is an answer to Borkowitz's approach to Marxist economics. And this goes back. And it's an important point, an important moment, because, some people accepted it as gospel and other people needed to go, well, no, it's not really, it has logical inconsistency and you need to sort of at least accept the inconsistencies or don't get so absolute about it. But that's kind of what this debate is about. I've obviously oversimplified, but that's kind of what's going on here. And note, of course, as I've been looking at Japanese stuff, Japanese scholars were just much more disciplined, very cultural thing. And Japanese Marxists, the more important ones, members of the Communist Party, clearly fluent in German and English, and et cetera. Moved a little bit in a slightly different direction, and had to, because the formative periods were problematic, of course, because Japanese capitalists and fascists, imperialists, decided they would screw up the entire Chinese economy, right? By trying to take it over. And so there's decades of stupid stuff that didn't allow Japanese communism and Chinese communism to talk to each other, and a wholly different set of issues. And it made it more complicated, actually. It's like it's just problematic. So anyway, Okishio and a bunch of other folks, and they're not in the wrong place. There's no right or wrong here. It's just simply that they, in a much more disciplined way, decided to take on the question and sort of answer it in its mathematical forms. You have Morishima and a bunch of other people. They're all guys, unfortunately. Ito, et cetera, trying to work through some of these problems. And ultimately, they sort of work through it. They go, okay, well, here it is all explained. And yes, it's still dependent on certain other matters. But this idea that a theory of crises is not a theory of collapse. And that's important. I mean, that's a really important point, because it is that fundamental Marxist problem of, was it going to be a revolution or not? As I started at the beginning of this little yammering. You could have small revolutions. I think that's what happens. Some guy in the military decides, well, I think I should be in charge, and I have the means to do it, and kind of that's the whole system of activity that we have going on. In other ways, either stupidity or whatever gets in the way and stuff happens. And there are, what, 10 or 15 wars going on right now that are essentially built on some of these elements. Some have to do with gold, some have to do with colonialism, some are neocolonial, some are settler colonial, etc. All of that's there, and you can spend all your time worrying about that as either center periphery or blah, 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 blah. And that's fine. The point, though, is mechanically speaking, how is it that we talk about crises? How big or small is it? What scale does it operate? Does its solidarity or similarity or structural relation to other those kinds of elements help us in our radical process? So I introduced that only because to make that simple distinction between Western European Marxism, which is problematic for all of its own reasons. Western Marxism uh, is problematic for a whole set of other reasons that have to do with a variety of things, including sociology and literary theory and a bunch of other stuff. But there still is something to learn from it, and it is learnable. You just don't have to not get so crazy about it, because if you do, uh, you wind up either self marginalizing yourself, or you know uh, the answers won't, you get into a lot of dead ends. So that's kind of where academia went, particularly because it was problematic, right? The issue between heterodox and orthodox thinking at various levels, at whether in terms of purity issues, tankies, entryism, Leninism, Trotskyism, all that other stuff, um, is symptomatic of exactly some of these issues. And in fact, theory of crisis is not a theory of collapse, is kind of, a fundamental issue. Is it about faith, or can you empirically prove it? Well, you could empirically prove it in the sense that, you get this period where, because of screw ups with the tariff process at the front end, at the back end, it screws up national economies and creates a global financial crisis that ultimately allows Nazism and fascism to come into play. Um, and much to our massive concern, in terms of people died. More people died than needed to die. Similarly, we have the same issue going on now, not quite at the same level. So, as you can see, I've included videos of the on this same issue, and the minutia is problematic, and some of it is driven by academic careers, one's total investment to it. There are a variety of people who will say, okay, uh, it's just simply a interpretation of classical political economy. It's not worried too much about Marx. Marx gives us a good way of getting at the problem, um, but let's not make ourselves too crazy about it from a ideological purity point of view. But yet, that's going to happen, and some people, people will challenge each other's math skills and blah blah blah, and it's just sort of, it's not silly, but it is, comes to the territory, and it's no different, particularly when you have overlapping fields, so that discussions of economy are not necessarily, discussions of politics, and yet they do interrelate, and then they get more complicated, right? Then you have to sort of think about, well, is it an international political economy question, or is it something that is regional, or, you know, there are just a variety of things. Is it a subset of the global? What direction does it have? Is it north or south, center or periphery, et cetera, et cetera? All of those things are there. Is it imperialism or not? You know, um, anyway, so I've included that little video, and then I've included, well, there's a whole session in here with David Harvey, talking about, and he's much younger, but talking about falling rate of profit and etc. So there's that. And then I've included an article, which I will begin reading now, even though obviously I've yammered for quite a long time now. And I don't know whether I'm going to get back to this or not. I might get back to this in a couple of hours prior to our little session together. Um, but I think you can see what I'm driving at is that there is a certain coherence. And I just started with one entry point, that is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the organic composition of capital. But ultimately, and things that I'm fiddling around with, and things that I think that this describes several decades of interest, and these go back particularly on the issue of Hegel. And it's not that, I mean, I'm kind of like David Harvey in the sense that Hegel is really hard to deal with, and dealing with it in English translation is not, with Hegel scholars, is maybe not the most fulfilling approach to the problem. And yet, it's probably our only approach to the problem, since there's no one, Hegel didn't do stuff in math. He did stuff in logic, but making it more logically coherent in the kind of Anglo-American analytical sense, or maybe not even that, in simply the continental sense, it takes a little work. But that work is good work to me. It is work that allows us to take a variety of things and get them to work together. That is, you can look at Frankfurt School critical theory and its certain set of positions on a variety of things. The fact that it doesn't deal with certain issues, that they're short on assuming, well, they overassume that, it's foundational, that you could have political economy in a certain direction, and it kind of trends towards, Luxembourgian kind of stuff, and it's sort of there, and that's fine. But you have all this other stuff, stuff driven by a variety of human sciences that makes it more complicated and creates a lot of dead ends. You need to have those dead ends on the one hand. On the other hand, it just makes working with it more difficult, makes people frustrated, makes people give up on things. And at some moment, you have to sort of bring all these things together. All right. Andy Blunden writes, Andy's done a bunch of stuff on, Fred Mosley. So Fred Mosley is at Holyoke and has done some of the best work in English and American English on analyzing Marx's Capital, and of course, appreciating the fact that many folks have returned or have reintroduced certain ideas that were important relative to Marx moving from supporting Hegelian ideas, and recall, issues Feuerbach, the young Hegelians, etc., and moving to appreciate that, for example, or the claim will be that, the Hegelianism comes back, is always there, in terms of building a dialectical model for, discussing capital, more advanced capital, in fact, that, using certain Hegelian ideas helps us cope with these larger scale issues that I've already mentioned. Fred Mosley's contribution to this debate in terms of capital and the concept logic, that is the later Hegel does 2 volumes on logic, and one is more encyclopedic, as it were, and one's shorter. And they're not problematic. They just simply are slightly different, and that's fine. And one needs to sort of work through, at least in English, the things about Hegel's logic. Anyway, Fred Mosley's contribution to this debate is unique in finding a basis in Hegel's logic for the structure of the whole of the 3 volumes of Capital. Now, within this, Mosley explains that the unique problem, which is solved by Volume 1 of Capital and resolves a number of difficult problems presenting in trying to understand Capital. Further, Mosley sees the concept logic as the key part of the logic needed to understand Capital, recognizing that for Marx and Hegel, the first task is to establish a concept of the subject matter in general. This is very similar to certain idiots talking about, well, I don't have a health policy. We have a concept of a plan for health policy, which doesn't help at all. But needless to say, you can see that there is a hierarchy, and there is a difference if you go to Frege or whatever, is that, concepts are not ideas. I mean, they can they can be composed of ideas, but it is kind of this difference, as linguistic studies will tell us, what is the difference between, grammar and, dealing with a lexicon or corpus, and this gets all the way back to LLM stuff. So ultimately, this has a relevance when you put all these things together. You just don't make yourself crazy worrying too much about it. That's the issue, I think, that takes down most academics. Further, Mosley sees the concept logic as the key part of the logic needed to understand Capital, recognizing that for Marx and Hegel, the first task is to establish a concept of the subject matter in general. Mosley shows that Volume 1 of Capital determines the total amount of surplus value appropriated by the capitalist class from the working class on the basis of concept of value whose substance is socially necessary labor time. So what we've been talking about, this seems repetitive, but it's more than that, because Hegel allows us to think in a dialectical way. Why is it that negation is a key part of this? Why is it that, structurally speaking, you need to discriminate between universals, particulars, and subjectivity, which are not identical? They're constituent parts of a kind of larger way of thinking that, you could trash from Hegel's moving in one direction and Marx is moving in the other. The fact is, Marx still appreciates that direction, still in a way that comes back to, and with all due respect, the formulation of these same ideas about the dialectic with Adorno and Horkheimer. That is, Frankfurt School is asking that same question, and folks who are looking at this, looking further at it in English as opposed to in German, that this is not problematic. You can think about Hegel's logic and think about Frankfurt School without a lot of difficulty. I know some people will make it difficult. It's not difficult. And in fact, in the negative dialectical sense, it actually makes a lot of sense. Anyway, in Volume 3, however, Volume 3 of Capital, Marx's Capital, however, mostly shows how Marx allows that products are exchanged on the basis of cost of production, not on their value. So what we're looking at here, just in this sentence, is the difference between Department 1 and Department 2, the difference between value and price and costs and a bunch of other things, right? Cost of production, not their value. Socially necessary labor time does not determine the exchange value of the products of capital. This is the distinction, right? And is easily understood if you differentiate, that is, it's not separating, but understanding the dichotomous nature of labor and labor power, as we started in the beginning. The result is that labor surplus value appropriated from the working class is shared between capitalists in proportion to their capital, so that the rate of profit is equalized. See, that we get back to the same point, right, that we wanted at the front end. That is, at the tendency of the rate of profit to fall requires us to think about profit as, in this large context, as being, you could aggregate it it has a certain shape. And you want to do that because you want to talk about how surplus value is appropriated from the working class and why the capitalists get stuff out of it, you know. Um, and they do it because they are maximizing profit. And the maximizing, I've used that for the first time there. I mean, on the one hand, it's better to think in those terms, that is maximizing and minimizing, minimax, etc. And there's a whole literature that supports this in the context of neoclassical economics. But you want to be careful about it because once you start going down that road, you begin to think, well, behaviorally, everyone does that. Well, no, not everyone does that. And in fact, you have evolutionary game theory, a bunch of behaviorism, a whole bunch of other stuff is trying to deal with that in ways that, on the one hand, are kind of useful, on the other hand, are useless because dead ends. I've talked about dead ends. So, next paragraph. In Money and Totality of 2016, Fred Mosley deals with a relatively small number of issues in Marx's Capital and its relation to Hegel's logic. But the issues that Mosley touches on include the most important and controversial aspects of Marx's approach. He examines these issues with admirable precision and thoroughness. I shall also refer to Mosley's chapter in Marx's Capital and Hegel's Logic of 2014, together with numerous partial drafts in Marx's correspondence with Engels, enable him to trace the gradual evolution of Marx's ideas until they reach the final form in 1867. Remember what I was talking about. We started in 1861. There's a bunch of stuff. And you have, 2 and 3 tier periods or 6-month periods where stuff doesn't get done or doesn't paid attention to. And it's all complicated. But it can be charted out. It's just that a lot of people haven't spent time doing that. And other people who chart it out have already made their decisions about certain things, and for whatever reason, partially because they don't do math, have decided what is or isn't important, and that's problematic. And you can see that when Mosley talks to Heinrich. They want to be nice to each other and they want to respect each other, but there's an issue underlying this that not that we should resolve it, but we should just see that some of this is a lost in translation problem. Anyway, Mosley's aim is to elucidate. Now, what this Mosley stuff that I'm referring to here is not just those 2 books that were mentioned above, the 2014 and 2016 books, but also, as I've been trying to point out in these last months, is the difference between the 1861 to 63 manuscripts and the later manuscripts that wind up being the 1864 and 65. And then ultimately there's the whole body of manuscripts all fitting with this up and down difference in manuscripts and references and cross-references and detours and whatever. So note that Mosley is really on this, and I think he does in English, kind of what Heinrich was trying to do. But and note, if you've been looking at Heinrich's work, is that he changes his mind or modifies it at certain moments about his summary of Marx's Capital. And I don't want to get into that, but it's pretty clear that you can see that was going on. It still is going on. It's fine. I mean, you just have to sort of go, well, that's not all the answers. And it's a really good point of view, but one that doesn't fully appreciate that there are other people thinking about this, and they've gone off into these other kind of realms that may be at the, in the last analysis, still a dead end, but have given us a way in which we can incorporate certain analytic skills into the overall process. Mosley's aim, back to the text, Mosley's aim is to elucidate key aspects of Marxist thinking, and he's done so in such a way that his conclusions are really, really beyond doubt. There's just one case where Mosley finds that Marx misspoke in Capital, and a couple of occasions where he claims that a word was chosen at the pleading of Engels in the interest of popularizing his ideas, but which have proved to obscure rather than elucidate Marx's meaning. Let me break here again and say that this is a very key point. You need to appreciate that certain concepts, which whole bodies of Marxists or other people have, either pilloried Marx for or whatever, are the result of Engels trying to work through this. And ultimately, not that Engels was wrong. He just wanted a certain way in which the science of this all should be interpreted, and can be seen to go down kind of other different paths. And I think that when you look at Bellamy Foster's work on Engels, that's kind of what's going on, and it's not a bad thing. It just simply has different results. So if you look at the history of science that like Bellamy Foster looks at in terms of expansion from certain scientific approaches that come from Engels or dialectics of nature and blah blah blah, and see how it's accepted or not accepted or modified or altered in the English speaking world. That's really important and really interesting, really interesting. But you also note that scientists, for example, who read all of the Engels kind of related stuff tend to have a certain other point of view that is problematic relative to analytic modeling. So when I refer to analytic modeling, I'm referring to the idea approached in the original analytic school, that is, Romer, Elster, all those other folks, but that it needed to move a little further beyond that. It was not problematic. I mean, it's problematic in the sense that other people trashed it or didn't take it up or don't think about it or want to go down some other weird route, Kantianism or something. Fine. But ultimately, we have to take them all into consideration in different measures and think about them as categorical issues. So otherwise, Moseley simply represents Marx's meaning and intention as written in the 3 volumes of Capital. He makes no effort in this book to consider how Marx's Capital could be updated for our own times. He leaves such thoughts to others, nor does he criticize or cast doubt on anything Marx wrote, other than the couple of minor errors, or what he claims are minor errors by Engels in his editing of Volume 3, or try to extend Capital beyond its scope as Marx left it. These few minor corrections are the exception that proves the rule, such as we are left in no doubt about Marx's intentions, insofar as that is humanly possible. Now, one of Moseley's achievements is to refute the claims of value theorists. And yes, there is this thing called value theorists, that there are 2 distinct measures of value throughout Capital. One in monetary prices, and the other value measured in socially necessary hours of labor. And that Marx failed to reconcile values with prices. So this is important, right? One of Moseley's achievements is to refute the claims of value theorists that there are 2 distinct measures of value throughout Capital. One in monetary prices, right? And the other measured in socially necessary hours of labor. And reconciling values of prices as a function of this is really important. And Moseley does this without simply abolishing the concept of abstract labor as the substance of value, as Rutten has done. And that's, you don't have to abolish the concept of abstract labor as the substance of value. I mean, it's just simply, it's a thing that you still need to sort of work through. All right. Volume 1 in the total surplus value, this is section 2. Volume 1 in the total surplus value. Moseley makes it very clear that the first assumption under which Marx's analysis is carried out is this: Marx's theory in all 3 volumes of Capital is about a single system. See, we're already back to TSSI, right? The single system, the actual capitalist economy, which is assumed to be in long-run equilibrium. That's the first assumption. Moseley's most important finding is the objective of Volume 1 is solely to determine the origin of surplus value and the exploitation of workers' unpaid labor time and the total quantity of surplus value appropriated from the working class by capitalists across the whole economy. It's not a bad finding, right? Marx's theory is structured according to 2 main levels of abstraction. That is, the production of surplus value and the distribution of surplus value, right, two main levels of abstraction. Department one, the production of surplus value, and two, Department two, the distribution of surplus value. I mean, it's the distribution of everything, but surplus value is the point we want to get out of this, because it is the means by which we can get to other kinds of elements that are analytically useful. So, and the production of surplus value is theorized prior to the distribution of surplus value, which means that the total surplus value in the economy as a whole is determined in volume one logically prior to its division into individual parts in volumes 2 and 3. Now, you may not think that that's an important point, and when you think about the history of the writing of the 3-volume and whittled down from the 6-volume project, is that you can see that this is an important point, but it is being logically prior is where the key element of this is. So to determine the total surplus value appropriated by capital presupposes a concept of value. Marx's concept of value is based on labor time, but it is not measured as such. Rather, value measures itself through the exchange process. Now, what does that mean? Is it negation? I mean, if a value measures itself through the exchange process, what's happening? Is it numerical? What does it look like? And the looking like, that is the form question, is kind of there. However, back to the text. However, the determination of the total surplus value is of profound significance, both ethically and in terms of understanding the vast economic infrastructure built on this total quantity of value and analyzed in later volumes. So now the point of the total here is, of course, a difficult concept, because total and totalizing is an entire body of stuff. So, there's a whole literature on total issues of the totality and, whatever. And so one needs to be sort of aware that there's this thing lurking in the background that can trip you up. And in terms of the vast economic blah, 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 and analyze labor, blah, capital, back to the text, capital is understood to be a single entity which nonetheless appears as distinct units of capital. So how can something be a single entity and nonetheless appear as distinct units? So obviously there's an identification problem here. So using the terminology of Hegel's concept logic, the universal moment of capital in general, is represented as these multiple units and quantified by the sum total of all such units. So, you sort of assume agglomeration at some moment, right? It makes no difference at this first stage of the analysis, then, how much surplus value is appropriated by each individual capital, so long as the total remains valid. So here we're already making that scale assumption, right? That there is a single capital, but there's individual capitals, right? This is a plural problem. So quantitatively, the effect is Marx is treating the entire economy as a single capital on the one hand, with each unit taken as quote unquote average, indifferent to the distribution of capital, labor, and surplus value between the individual units of capital. So on the one hand, we have a way of summarizing or aggregating or agglomerating these kinds of ideas, but we also assume that that is only part of the picture. So without, verging off into a whole theoretical thing, but you can see what issue is going here is a certain identification problem, a certain problem of agglomeration or summary or whatever. And these are logical problems. Is it intersection? Is it union? It's a set problem in at least at one level. So anyway, back to the text. Moseley cites the Grundrisse. Let me break here for the moment. Grundrisse, remember, David Harvey picks it up again, returns to it. The Grundrisse is important because it does give a certain structural kind of view of the project of capital. And because no one saw the Grundrisse for decades, its perspective is kind of important relative to all the post-war things that required kind of rethinking, after the Grundrisse comes out. Now, the Grundrisse is not this, or document or magic rock or something. Rather, it just simply gives us certain structural elements that we know Marx is thinking about, and that now have come to, it's not a hidden thing. It's just that it was always there. It just we needed to sort of get a little better picture of it. So Mosley cites the Grundrisse to the extent that we are considering it here as a relation distinct from that of value and money. Capital is capital in general, i.e., the incarnation of the qualities which distinguish value as capital from value as pure value or capital as money. So here we have three different things: value as capital, distinguished from value as pure value, or as money. Money as a purer form. Let's try and interpret this. Money is therefore a purer form of value. Not so much purer, more neutral, perhaps, more fungible, whatever. So there's certain ideas going on here that are useful, and you need to hold those in your mind, that you can think of these things as wholes, as complete things, as totalities, but also recall that the force of it is as a function of all these other, components, constituents, right? So value, money, circulation, et cetera, prices, et cetera, are presupposed, as is labor. So value, money, circulation, prices, all that stuff, they're all presupposed. They form the assumptions for our movement forward, right? And labor is part of it. But we're still concerned neither with a particular form of capital nor with an individual capitalist distinct from other individual capitalists, etc. So this is a macro-micro problem. We need to think in more general terms, as we would if we were thinking in a Hegelian way. And a way in which we can get at this problem is the idea of the general intellect, because it gives us a picture that Marx is thinking about. Well, okay, you have different individual minds, but you have knowledge. You have something that aggregates all of this in a variety of ways. All right. We are present at the process of its becoming. So this is on top. This is the social ontology of capital. This dialectical process of its becoming is only the ideal expression of the real movement through which capital comes into being. So note that there is reality, and then there's an ideal expression, appearance. So without going too far down the road, but this is the idea. This is a semiotic problem. That is, you have the signifier, yes, and all of those signifieds, right? And this is that may not make it clearer to you, but if you think of this semiotically, it begins to make more sense, whatever that means. The later relations are to be regarded as developments coming out of this germ. This claim, which Mosley documents meticulously, seems at odds with Marx's exposition, which refers to, throughout volumes 1 and 2, to single units of capital, each with its expenditure on constant capital, that is machinery, materials, etc., variable capital in the form of wages, and the increase in the money invested once the product is sold, right? So these are all component parts of this. And I don't think it seems, for me, it doesn't seem at odds. So it just simply is you're engaging in the kind of categorizing process, speaking mathematically. All right. From this, A quantum of surplus value is calculated by simple subtraction. Yes, all that algebra. Total price of the product minus money outlaid on wages, materials, and fixed capital. Simple subtraction. That is total price of the product minus money outlaid on wages, materials, and fixed capital. A rate of surplus value determined by the proportion of surplus value to the variable capital invested, and a rate of profit by the proportion of the surplus value to the total capital invested. Now, I know that maybe sound like gibberish, but it isn't. The rate of surplus value is a proportion, right? And what is it a proportion of? It is a proportion of, capitals, multiple capitals, variable capital, fixed capital, and rates of profit, as we were talking about before, by the proportion of the surplus value to the total capital invested. Now, the mistake that people make, if there is a mistake, is to think of this all as, well, I can put a couple of things here and this all works out fine. As we've seen from the examples that I've already talked about above, is this is not, it's not that easy. Let's just put it that way. So we go further. Back to the text. Both rates are calculated with respect to each individual unit of capital. It's a matter of indifference whether the rate of surplus value or the rate of profit determined from each unit of capital varies from one particular sector of the economy to another or is uniform. Well, uniformity is a problem. And once you start saying, well, it should be uniform, well, it's not uniform. It's all stuff's going on, and you're not, quote unquote, indifferent to it in that particular context. So what matters is only the total, and Marx makes no claim that the rate of surplus value, the rate of profit of the composition of each capital, that is the ratio of constant to variable capital, constant capital to variable capital, is uniform. Marx makes no claim that it's uniform. So note that on the one hand, it is, we don't care about whether it's uniform, but the total, assuming that it appears as totals and that they are uniform, is a big deal. Note also in the quote from the Grundrisse of the reference to the germ out of which logically later forms of capital will grow. That is, the unit of capital at first conceived in the exposition of it must be seen as a quote-unquote germ cell that connects with the commodity as the economic cell form mentioned by Marx in the 1867 preface to Capital. So we can see that that's on his mind. The ecological elements and all that other stuff is sort of, he's thinking about it. And he's thinking about it because it's this part of this bigger circuit. So this viewpoint is quantitatively equivalent to considering the economy as one unit of capital, except by its very nature, capital, this is when I keep yakking about things that are more complicated, capital exists in numerous competing units, not a single whole, but a whole nonetheless, W-H-O-L-E. Moseley cannot tell is why then Marx posed the issue in Volume 1 solely in terms of single units of capital and not in terms of an entire economy. But he does show that this is indeed what Marx did. Moseley correctly insists that Marx's interest in Volume 1 is the total surplus and the proportion of that surplus value to the total capital invested in workers' means of subsistence, and that this constitutes beginning with the universal in Hegel's terms. Right? So this is why it's still, with all due respect, Hegelian, okay? Anyway, in adopting this approach, Marx is following Hegel's example perfectly. But how is it that he deals throughout Volume 1 with single units of capital, thus appearing to begin not from the universal, but from the individual? I will return to this issue later when I deal with Moseley's claim about the relation of the structure of capital and the structure of Hegel's logic, because it is the total values which are to be determined here in volume 1. There is no problem in treating all the factors as averages, since average simply means dividing the given total by the number of units. Now, that all seems very simple on the one hand. On the other hand, you need to think about why is he trying to do this? And Marx is trying to think about averages from a, with all due respect, a kind of statistical point of view or a probabilistic point of view, perhaps. That is, he's trying to describe this in a way that allows him to connect with the reader or readers. And anyway, it does not matter that the average as such forms no part of the motivation of any of the parties involved and has no material representation of the economy as in the economy as such, but is simply derived analytically from the total. So it's derived, and it's derived analytically from this concept of the total. So average is kind of a proxy for thinking of these things as collections of things, of units. If one were to keep one's focus on the single firms, then as Marx appears to invite us to, take the surplus labor time measured against the variable capital invested, determine a rate of surplus value for that firm, and against the total of constant and variable capital invested to determine the rate of profit for that firm, then we would find that the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value vary from firm to the next, from one firm to the next, with no consistent proportion between them. Let me stop there and say, well, right. I mean, that just seems normal. And that seems an accurate description of what reality might be. Now, if all workers are taken, back to the text, if all workers are taken to be equally industrious and buying their means of subsistence from the same market, and capitalists are taken to be paying for labor power at its value and applying the socially necessary technology, then it would seem that the rate of surplus value would tend to be uniform across all units of capital, while the rate of profit would vary according to the composition of each unit of capital. So the point being, of course, that surplus value is a further abstraction of all of this stuff. So it's not controversial. It doesn't contradict, the fact that every firm would have a different rate of profit. Capital would be different, but you could measure yet at another level, a kind of abstraction of surplus value across all of this. So you have successive layers of meta levels, as it were. So anyway, we'll get back to that. But empirically, this is not the case. This is there a very strong empirical tendency toward the equalization of the rate of profit across the capitalist economy. Yes, that's true. A tendency towards the equalization of the rate of profit. And that gets us to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. But that's overgeneralizing. That's over, whatever. This is, how much stock are we going to place in that? Let's put it that way. Now, this is the root of the claim by value theorists like Heinrich that Marx has failed to solve the transformation problem. So the point being is not to have solved it or to have solved it. I think what one needs to say is that the transformation problem was one way of talking about this that did not necessarily have to be solved. It's a problem without a solution. Moseley resolves this paradox, which has emerged at this stage, by examining the distinction between commodities produced by capital and simple commodities sold at value by their producer. Okay, how is it that we can think about these? Well, one way of thinking about it is that they're just components in a system, right? It's the difference between buying a Lego set that is fully organized or configured and buying individual blocks. So that doesn't necessarily solve all the problems, but that's kind of what we're looking at. But in volume one, Marx is not taking account of the capital market and its effect on the distribution of surplus value between capitalists. So, and that's kind of what's going on at the, you know, that in each department, if we were going to departments, lots of other things going on. Capital moves around. And as capital moves around, surplus value moves around. So price and value in volume one. Oh, value and price. Three, prices for one and the same product may vary from one moment to the next to the extent that the transitory and incidental factors impact on the price realized upon sale. In these circumstances, it's common to take price as the actual and value as the average. It's more an average, but anyway, eliminating statistical noise. Now, this is exactly where, Mockover, etc. This is, this is where we have the macro problems kind of pop out. However, if the assumption underlying the analysis is that of long-run equilibrium, this distinction is redundant. So if the assumption underlying the analysis is that of long-run equilibrium as opposed to short-run equilibrium, not even talking about general equilibrium. In keeping with this assumption, price is taken to be average price, and in line with this, Moseley insists that in volume one, quantitatively, value is price. So that's, it's a long set of arm waving, but it's only by, it's an assumption. It's a simplifying assumption. That's all. Don't make yourself crazy. It is simply, a heuristic in that sense. So don't, price can be distinguished from value in the sense that one could talk of value as a hypothetical or expected price. Now, here, is where we can begin to think, oh, well, maybe our relations here are Bayesian. And let's not get too crazy, but here we have some way in which we could talk about this without getting us into trouble. But once a commodity is sold, its value has been realized as its price, and value is purely a matter of speculation until the commodity is sold. So, in other words, all yammering about this is really against a hypothetical owner who has or wants exchange value. And hopefully you can follow that. No further distinction is possible. Price is value, or more precisely in Hegelian terms, the appearance of value, and like any appearance, is unstable. This is that appearance essence thing that, Hegelian presumptions of this, which go back to, the Platonic, these are matters of importance. A distinction not without a difference. Although the value of a commodity is not known until the value appears in the form of the price it realizes, it is value, which determines price, not the other way around. Well, we can get into an argument about that because, price is fluid in that particular context. So anyway, just like the color of an object is determined by material properties of the object, but it appears only when light is shed upon its surface. Just like the color of an object is determined by material properties of the object, but it appears only when light is shed upon its surface. So without overindulging the physics of it, this is an interesting question. These are questions on the one hand of a superficial nature, but they're issues nonetheless from a material point of view. The quantity of labor embodied in the commodity is a matter of concern when setting up the production process, but It is a matter of indifference to both buyer and seller once it comes to the point of sale. In other words, or hopefully you can see that this is where, embodied labor might be interesting and useful, but it is conditioned on certain other matters. That is, when it changes hands, changes ownership, blah, 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 blah. When a capitalist buys an input from another capitalist, the market will tend to drive that cost of the input down to its cost of production, including the cost of borrowing, nothing to do with its value. The past history of the object and the amount of embodied labor is of no account to capitalists. They don't give a crap. If the capitalist is buying labor power from a worker, then he will pay a wage, which also represents its cost of production, which will be equal to its value in terms of, volume one thinking. When he's buying input from a fellow capitalist, then the situation is different. We know that the total labor time embodied in commodities simply being simply the total hours of labor expended by the entire working class employed by capital on a given quantity of the given product. All deviations between the actual labor time expended by a given unit of capital and the average is accounted for by the qualification of socially necessary. So let me break here and say, well, that's one way of putting it. It's a kind of dodge on the one hand. On the other hand, it does say in a materialist way, it's contingent on these other matters. The seller's loss is the buyer's gain, and the total value is unaffected. Now, this presumes, of course, a certain degree of unfettered exchange. Now, if someone is swindled, swindling is still part of this. This only means that a share of the value is illegitimately passed from one to another. So if you think you're getting, rooked, then you are, or whatever. Further, labor of the average type, labor at the basic wage, so to speak, is typical of a modern industrial capitalist economy engaged in skinning chickens one day and packing parcels for Amazon the next. Marx calls this abstract labor. It is abstract, first of all, because it lacks any concrete quality. It's simply measurable by time. For Marx, the number of working days, it being presumed that the workers are made to work as long a working day as possible under given conditions of labor. So all of these are simplifying assumptions, right? It is things that are abstract are not necessarily complex. We think they're complex because they appear to us as complicated, but they're not. They're just complex. They're not the same. It is abstract as well as in the sense that the act of purchase and sale valuing a commodity at a certain sum of money determines post facto the labor time which has been socially necessary, not the actual labor time expended, because we don't really know that. I mean, we have a sense of it, but we don't really have So, for example, you have a can of cashews. You really need to get a sense of, now, how did it get to the can? I mean, how does it get from, bushes somewhere else and finally into the can? There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on, and it's not what you think, or it's what you think, but it's kind of distressing when you think about it. But anyway, that's my cashew example. Here, the entirety of existing social conditions come into play. The measurement by labor time is, in that sense, abstract, but on average, across the economy, it'll be quantitatively different. But on average, across the economy, it will be quantitatively exact in its determination. Thus, money is the measure of socially necessary labor time under the conditions presumed in volume 1, namely long-term equilibrium and commodities bought and sold at their value. So we've already have some distinguishing assumptions at the front end. Now, putting this the other way around, money is the appearance of abstract labor. Now, this is a transformation that for some people is, it's kind of difficult to get there, but it's there. Or as Moseley puts it, the value of commodities in Marxist theory is a complicated as a saying, complicated concept which has three interrelated aspects, three interrelated aspects. Number one, the substance of value, that is, as abstract labor. The substance of value as abstract labor. That's number one. Number two, the magnitude of value, that is, socially necessary labor time. So it has it has substance, but it also has magnitude. And then number three, the necessary form of appearance of value. So the necessary forms, one that we can subvert if we're shoplifters, is money and prices. Now, after section 3 of chapter 1, the value of commodities, when presented without further attribution, usually refers to the third aspect. That is the form of appearance of value in terms of money and prices. I mean, it's just what we've grown up with. It is the interchangeability of labor time in a modern industrial economy which makes labor a universal and makes the adding up of labor time and the measurement of abstract labor a valid, quote unquote, real abstraction. Now, such a kind of labor is essential to modern capitalism. It's just how stuff works. It's why it works the way it does. It's why you have, it's my example of the pay stub again. It's how they measure your value, your value. Now, let me stop here because I've yacked for a while, and we'll come back at section 4, and we haven't gotten halfway through this yet, but we can talk about this further on. But I think for office hours, I think this is up to where we can be. So we hope that that's the way it is. All right. So we leave off at the beginning of circulation and turnover time of capital, which is a way of talking about some of these matters. And so I will cut the live stream on our little session here and come back to you either in a kind of a period where we start a little early before office hours starts to kind of get an assessment if anyone showed up, and maybe just to continue yakking about this stuff. You may not get a lot about it. I have, because I could, if I were going to talk to people about this, if I were teaching, I can now explain, at least in my little brain, I can explain the degrees, levels, and distinguishing characteristics of discussing Marx, and to show with not a lot of effort, and particularly when you read theories of surplus value, because Marx is trying to say, okay, these are my sources. These are my reigning ideas that I've gotten some of these concepts from, and this is where I'm going with it, because it needed to assemble some of these things. Some people don't have a labor theory of value, or they haven't dealt with labor, and in others, they already assumed out some other issues, thinking them only, the other conditions that make them more complicated. So without getting too far into that, that's kind of what Marx is doing. He's trying to say, okay, this is how stuff happens. This is the way the market goes. This is how people estimate things like value and prices, and our actions in reference to that. And ultimately, they need to be reconciled in a certain way. Now, we know, of course, from a qualitative and quantitative point of view, that Marx doesn't quite get there, and that we need to sort of fill in a lot of blanks, but we'll get there eventually. So I will stop.